My name is Joanne, and this happened when I was 18. My older sister Janet and I still lived with our parents back then. I decided not to go to college that year and didn't really know what I was doing. Janet was attending the local college studying nursing, but she was off when this story took place. She and one of her friends from school were planning a camping trip and asked me to come, probably out of pity, since I was always just hanging around our parents' house. I agreed to go, not because I love camping or anything, but because I was getting bored at home all the time. I didn't know Sarah very well, because Janet hadn't been friends with her for very long. I tagged along but felt like a third wheel from the start. We made the 4-hour drive on a Saturday morning and got to our site by midday. The campsite was crowded with a lot of other people around, including many families. Kids were running around everywhere, and there were some younger people like us as well. It was the kind of place where everyone books a spot ahead of time and has to stay within the designated area. Besides the crowds, there was a beach in the park and quite a vast forest with many hiking trails. On the first night, we noticed a group of guys next to us. They were older, probably in their mid-20s. Once we got our fire going in the early evening, they came over to our site. We stood around talking for a while, and they introduced themselves as Jamie and Frank. They were friendly, but I could tell they were more interested in Janet and Sarah. On the second day, the other two went to check out the beach. I had been there earlier and didn't feel like going back, so I was alone at the campsite. Jamie and Frank showed up again while Janet and Sarah were still away. They walked up to me while I was sitting around the smoldering log in our fire pit, poking it occasionally. I looked up as they got close, then Frank asked where the other two were. I could tell he was looking for them. I said that they would be back soon, then Frank looked at Jamie and back to me. He then told me that they found a spot on one of the trails and asked me to come with them. They said it had a great view of the lake from a high point. I was curious and feeling a bit adventurous, so I decided to go with them. We walked down the trail, chatting about random things, but after half an hour, we were pretty deep in the woods. The forest was getting thicker by the second, and we were far away from the kids and families that were near the sites. What was worrying me the most, though, was that the trail seemed to be going downhill. If there was really a great view, then it would have to be going up. The trail became narrower and more overgrown with trees. There were a few times when I thought we were lost, but the two guys pressed forward, and I followed. It was then that I realized how vulnerable I was out there with two random guys. I didn't know them, after all. Eventually, we reached a clearing in the woods, and there was a tent set up. Jamie and Frank stopped ahead of me, both of them standing in front of the tent. I walked up beside them and looked at Jamie, confused. "Is this it?" I asked. Neither of them said a word. I walked over to the tent and looked inside the open front flap. There was a sleeping bag rolled out and a few items scattered around next to it. I could see a bottle of alcohol and a roll of duct tape, among other things. I turned to Jamie and Frank. "Why do you have a tent set up here?" I asked. Jamie smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We like to come out here sometimes. It's a nice spot to relax away from the main campsite." I obviously wanted to get out of there, but I wanted to play it off like I didn't know what they were up to. I was really at their mercy anyway. "I think I should head back," I said. "My sister will be looking for me." Before I could turn around, Jamie grabbed my arm. "No need to rush. Stay a while," he said, then squeezed my arm tighter. I yanked my arm free and slapped him in the face. The time to play nice had ended, but to be honest, I regretted the slap right away. Not that he didn't deserve it, but I could see how angry he got. Frank moved to block my path, but I was quicker. I pushed past him and sprinted down the trail, which I could hardly see. I could hear them coming behind me, but I didn't stop. My only focus was getting back faster than them. The trail seemed longer on the way back, but I just kept moving. I stumbled a few times and almost lost the trail. After what felt like an eternity, I made it back to the main area with all the campsites and people. Only then did I give myself the chance to catch my breath. I leaned over to rest at a site with a family right next to me. Just then, Frank and Jamie ran up beside me. I screamed when I saw them, and when I did, it drew the attention of an older man at the site next to us. He looked at me as if he was concerned. We made eye contact, and just then, I started to cry. He and a woman came over to me, and Frank and Jamie ran away. When the man got to me, I told them what happened out in the woods. Within an hour, the park rangers and the police were involved. As I later found out, Frank and Jamie were already gone before anybody was able to question them. They surely would have denied it, but I could have led the police back to that creepy spot in the woods that they set up. It would have looked bad for them. They were surely planning something awful out there in the woods, but I think they were really more after my sister. I guess when they found me alone, they decided that I was good enough. To this day, I am thankful that it was me and not her, because I have no idea if she would have managed to escape. I'm Josh, and this happened in the early 2000s right after I got married. My wife Danielle and I met in college, and right after we graduated, we started planning our wedding. We tied the knot before either of us was making any real money, so our parents were helping us a lot. We didn't have the money for a real honeymoon, so we were planning to save and do something special within the next few years. However, my wife's family owned a cabin only a few hours away from where we were living. It was a beautiful place, and I had been there once before. It was on a 5-acre lot surrounded by public land, so it was quite a nice, secluded spot. After our wedding, Danielle and I drove out there in my old Toyota Camry. It wasn't pretty, but it was still surprisingly reliable. We arrived in the early evening on Saturday, just after the sun went down. We were planning to stay for a week minus a day, so there was a lot of time to relax. On the first night, we just stayed in and went to bed pretty early. Not much happened the next day or the day after. But one evening, as the sun was setting, I was sitting on the porch in one of the 2 chairs. That was when I noticed a column of smoke about 200 yards ahead. It seemed to be coming from our property, so I was concerned. I decided to check it out, so I shouted to my wife that I'd be back soon, then headed toward the smoke. There wasn't really any path heading in that direction, so I started walking on the road. It was kind of going the right way, so I was able to maintain a constant line of sight with the smoke. I thought it was most likely that somebody wandered onto our property by accident, thinking it was public land. That kind of thing can happen, and it is usually no big deal. Still, my wife's parents asked that we tell campers that it is private property. Once I was around level with where the smoke was coming from, I had to step into the woods, leaving the road behind. In the forest, I lost sight of the smoke, but tried to keep a straight line. Eventually, I found the spot where it was coming from. There was a smoldering log and some trash scattered around. It was clear someone had been there recently. I walked around for a few minutes, hoping to find the person or people, said hello a few times, but nobody answered. Not knowing what else to do, I decided to head back to the cabin and check on my wife. I had been gone for almost 20 minutes, and I didn't want her to worry. I kicked some dirt onto what was left of the fire, then turned back the way I came. As I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods were quiet, and I didn't know where that person went. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I walked up the stairs. That was when I noticed that the front door was wide open. I walked in, and standing in the living room was a man holding my wife from behind. From what I could tell, he looked crazy. His clothes were dirty and torn, so I thought he was living out in the woods or something. My wife's eyes were wide with fear, but she was fairly calm considering everything. I needed to do the same. "What do you want?" I asked. He didn't answer, just stared at me. I could see he was shaking slightly, which only made me more nervous. "Please just let her go," I said, taking a step forward. "We don't want any trouble. We can help you if you need something." He glanced at me, then back at my wife. For a moment, it looked like he was considering my words, but that was probably false hope. I held my breath, hoping he would let her go. Then, without warning, my wife elbowed him hard in the ribs. The man gasped and let go for a split second, just enough for her to break free. We sprinted out the door and jumped into the car. I pulled the keys out of my pocket and got the engine started. We sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and the man behind us. It was almost dark by then, and the headlights were all we had to guide our way. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, about 20 miles away. My wife and I were both shaken but relieved to be safe. We went straight to the police station and reported what had happened. Even though I thought it was an emergency, they wouldn't go out until the morning. It was a small town, so they didn't have the resources to deal with a potential threat like that at night. We spent the evening at a small motel, but of course, we couldn't sleep. We mostly stayed up talking. Early the next morning, we returned to the cabin with the police. As we approached, my stomach churned. Smoke was still rising in the distance, and when we arrived, our worst fears were confirmed. The cabin was completely burned down, reduced to a smoldering pile of ash and charred wood. The smell of burnt timber hung heavy in the air. My wife clung to my arm, tears welling up in her eyes. We stood there in silence, watching as the last of her family cabin smoldered. The police and fire crew did an investigation of the site, but there wasn't much to go on. The man had vanished without a trace, and any evidence that could have helped identify him was likely destroyed in the fire. One thing they were able to tell us, though, was that human remains were not found among the rubble, so it did seem that the man got away. We decided to stay with my wife's parents for a few days while we figured out our next steps. They were shocked and saddened by what had happened, but of course, they were relieved that we were safe. So that was my first week as a married man. Luckily, our lives have only gotten better since then. The cabin was rebuilt a few years later, and they sold it a few years after that. I never bothered going to the new one. This happened to me many years ago in a neighborhood I used to live in. I lived in a quiet neighborhood in a hilly area. It was a nice neighborhood with a lot of winding roads, big houses, and large yards. Most of the houses in the area seemed to be built by the same company because they looked similar. The basements of the houses were actually on ground level, with the main floor and upper levels above that. All the houses had a big set of stairs attached, so to access the main floor, you wouldn't have to go through the basement area. Due to the ground level basements, many people had sliding doors that led out into the backyard. The reason for the in-depth description of the layout is that this is how my house was built. The last summer I spent living in that neighborhood, there were a series of break-ins. My house was included. The night my house was broken into, I wasn't there, but a couple of items were taken from my basement, including a bike. Later that summer, on one of my evening walks, I was shocked to see a younger man riding towards me on what appeared to be my bike. I figured this guy probably bought my bike from the person who stole it, and I could get some information on the culprit. I flagged down the guy on the bike, indicating that I wanted to talk to him. When I mentioned that the bike was mine and I was interested in who he bought it from, the young man suddenly appeared very uncomfortable. Instantly, I realized this might be the guy who had stolen my bike and broken into basements throughout the neighborhood. Before he could pedal away, I grabbed a firm hold of one of the handlebars to stop him. Further confirming my suspicion, the young man jumped off the bike and, to my surprise, pulled out a small knife or switchblade. Full of fear from the sudden escalation, I quickly hopped onto my bike and put some distance between us by biking down the street. The young man took a couple of steps towards me as if he was going to chase me, but thought better of it and ran away. I biked home and notified the cops immediately, describing the young man. I also alerted our neighborhood group chat about the young man and gave a brief description of him. The cops never found him or identified who he was. Nobody in our neighborhood saw him again, or had another basement broken into. But I was still nervous that I might run into the violent man again someday. It ended up being a frightful encounter, but at least I got my bike back.